Hi, I'm Dr. Evan Matthews. I'm here today to talk to you about skeletal muscle. All right, so the skeletal muscle is just one of our three types of muscle. So again, skeletal being one of those, cardiac muscle, which is the muscle of the heart, and then smooth muscle, which is the muscle of the digestive tract and the blood vessels of the body. All right, so just to talk about some of the differences between these, the cells themselves look different. So skeletal muscles, the cells are very large, they're very long, they're also very orderly. And so you're going to be able to see actual striations in the muscles if you look at it under a electron microscope. If you look at the cardiac muscles, they are much smaller, they're much shorter, they have a branching shape. They do have striations, but they're not as orderly, so it wouldn't be as easy to see on an electron microscope. So you can see that they have these sort of Y-type shapes to them and a lot of branches, like I mentioned. The smooth muscle is shaped more like a spindle, all right, so it's skinny on the two ends and a little wider in the center, and they're not going to have striations that are going to be visible. Some other differences here: the skeletal muscle have more than one nuclei in each cell. We'll talk about how that occurs in satellite cells in a later portion of this series on skeletal muscle. The cardiac and the smooth muscle are both mononucleated, so they only have one nucleus. How we use them in our body are also very different. So skeletal muscle is only used occasionally, mostly voluntarily. So because it's a voluntary muscle that we control, it's not going to be used quite as much. Cardiac muscle and smooth muscle are going to be used continuously. The cardiac muscle is got a rhythmic pattern to it, so that's what causes the heartbeat. And then the smooth muscle is in continuous use as well, but it's a much slower contraction. And the last major difference I want to talk about between the three types of muscle is the source of calcium used for the initiation of muscle contraction. All right, so calcium is used for all three of these in order to initiate the muscle contraction. In skeletal muscle, it mostly comes from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is an organelle inside the cell itself. In cardiac muscle, the calcium is going to be in the sarcoplasmic reticulum or endoplasmic reticulum, and it's going to be released from there just like it was in just like it was in skeletal muscle. But when it's released, it's going to also cause the opening of calcium channels that are going to cause more calcium to come into the cell from outside the cell, and that's where a lot of the calcium is going to come from in cardiac muscle. In smooth muscle, it's also going to be coming from outside the cell, similar to what it was in cardiac muscle. All right, so why do we have muscles? First off, we have lots of them. We have around 400 skeletal muscles in the body. Again, we're just talking about skeletal muscle from this point out, and it's about 40 to 50% of our total body weight. So it's a lot of our mass is skeletal muscle. All right, the main functions are locomotion, so just moving your body, as well as breathing. So we use skeletal muscles in order to breathe. We use skeletal muscles in order to support our body so we can stay upright. So I can be sitting right now. This is because I'm contracting muscles in my torso, allowing me to be in this position. We also use skeletal muscles in heat production. So when you're cold, your body's going to cause you to start having shivers. Those shivers are little small contractions in a very short series of them, which produces a lot of heat for the body. It allows you to raise your body temperature back up to a level that is more normal, so that you don't have to shiver anymore. So those are the main purposes of our muscles. All right, so how do we use our muscles? How do we move our muscles? Thinking about locomotion again here. All right, so there are three different types of muscle contractions. We have the isometric muscle contraction, which is what's shown here. Isometric means that there is no change in the length of the muscle. All right, so you hold the muscle, so this is just a wall sit. So you hold the muscle and it's contracting, it's holding you up, or it's doing whatever it is you're trying to do, but it's not getting shorter and it's not getting longer. That's an isometric muscle contraction. We have dynamic contractions, which are the concentric and the eccentric muscle contractions. These are the ones that we typically think of. All right, so concentric is a shortening of the muscle. All right, so if we're talking about the bicep here, it is the muscle getting shorter as it contracts. where eccentric, this downward phase for the bicep curl, is when the muscle gets longer and it's still contracting. So when you slowly lower the weight down, it's eccentrically contracting in order to control that lowering of the weight. All right, so again, the concentric and eccentric are the dynamic muscle contractions that we do. All right, so when we move our muscles, we're oftentimes going to be changing our joint angles. All right, so when a joint gets smaller, so if we look at the same movement from before, the bicep curl, when the joint is smaller, that is flexion. All right, so flexion is the joint angle getting smaller. So looking at the tricep extension exercise here, you're extending the elbow, so you're making it from a shorter angle to a longer angle or a bigger angle, and that is again called an extension. All right, so a angle getting smaller, a joint angle getting smaller is flexion. A joint angle getting bigger is extension. All right, so we can also have spinal extension and flexion. All right, so it's a little harder to visualize because which direction smaller angles and which directions bigger angles. If you think about the body in anatomical position with the body facing you, if the body's coming towards you, that is going to be flexion. If it's going away from you, that's going to be extension. All right, so going from this position, which is a neutral spine, to this position, that is flexion. That's spinal flexion. We also have abduction and adduction. All right, so abduction with the B is when you move a limb away from the body. Adduction with two D's is when you move the limb towards the body. So you're adding the limb towards your body. All right, so abduction away, adduction toward. There are other movements that we could describe here. We're going to just keep it simple, but here's a link, and I'll try to put this in the description below as well. All right, so when you're moving your limbs, you're bound to eventually get tired, right? So we think of the words muscle fatigue, meaning that there's going to be a decrease in both force and velocity that the muscles are producing. All right, so again, you're getting tired. All right, so muscle fatigue is caused by several different things, and it's different depending on the situation as well. So if you're doing a very high intensity exercise, something that is going to be typically 60 seconds or less, so about a minute or less, the fatigue that you're going to experience is going to be an accumulation of byproducts from the exercise. So things like lactic acid, other acids, adenosine diphosphate, which is the breakdown product from adenosine triphosphate, the unit of energy the body uses, the extra phosphate from that ATP as well, so that's another breakdown product, and also free radicals. So free radicals are molecules that are going to cause damage to other molecules by trying to steal electrons from their outer electron orbit. So those are also able to cause muscle fatigue type sensations. And all of these are essentially going to get in the way of the myofilaments, the actin and the myosin, and their ability to grab onto each other and pull. All right, so we'll talk more about those in the next section of this lecture. All right, so again, under 60 seconds, mostly an accumulation of byproducts of intense exercise that are going to cause the fatigue. If you're doing longer, a little slower type exercise, 2 to 4 hours worth of exercise, so think of like a marathon, then the muscle factors that are going to cause fatigue are going to be an accumulation of those free radicals I already talked about. It's also going to be potentially an electrolyte imbalance. All right, so if you don't remember, go back and look at the neural control side of things. The muscles require a balance of sodium and potassium just like the neurons do. And so if the electrolytes become imbalanced, that can cause a decrease in muscle action. Also, we have glycogen depletion. All right, so glycogen depletion is when you use up the storage form of glucose inside the muscle. And because our muscles prefer to use glucose just because it's quick and readily available, if you deplete that, you're going to see some fatigue. You're going to have to slow down your exercise intensity. We also have another type of fatigue that isn't talked about nearly as much called central fatigue. Central fatigue is the depletion of the excitatory neurotransmitters used in order to cause muscle contraction. All right, so the muscles only contract when neurons are stimulating them, telling them to. All right, so if those neurons start to wear out themselves basically by releasing too much neurotransmitter, so too much acetylcholine typically is what we're talking about, it's going to run out of acetylcholine eventually. And in doing so, you get this central fatigue, so this central nervous system fatigue that the neurons just aren't going to be activated as quickly or as often as what they normally would be. And that also causes sensations of fatigue that slows you down, decreases the force of the muscle force production as well. All of these are going to be sources of fatigue that you're going to experience in a typical sporting event or some sort of intense exercise bout, whether it's long or short and intense. All right, so talking about fatigue, we also should probably talk about muscle cramps. All right, so fatigue is when the muscle is slowing down, not contracting as hard as you want it to, and you start to get a decrease in exercise performance. Muscle cramps are kind of the opposite, but they also affect muscle performance and function. All right, so a muscle cramp is when the muscle contracts and you don't want it to. It's usually a very forceful contraction, usually very painful. Most of you have probably experienced a muscle cramp before. So there's two basic theories explaining muscle cramps, and these are not competing theories necessarily. They are more, there's certain situations where one or the other is more applicable. All right, so if you are exercising for a long period of time and you're sweating a lot, you're using up a lot of electrolytes, so you're sweating out sodium, things like that, then you can get cramps because of the electrolyte depletion theory. All right, so basically, again, you need to have that proper balance of sodium, potassium inside and outside the muscle, and if you don't, then it's going to cause the muscle to potentially contract when you don't want it to, causing a muscle cramp. The other theory here is the altered neural muscular control theory. Right, so you have these different muscle afferents. So think the muscle spindle and the Golgi tendon organ that together control or help to modulate the muscle's action. Right, so the Golgi tendon organ tends to calm the muscle down a little bit. Muscle spindle tends to increase the contraction of that muscle, so it stimulates the muscle. If these two get out of sync with each other, all right, so if you get not enough inhibition from the Golgi tendon organ or too much stimulation from the muscle spindle, this can also cause a muscle to cramp up. So the muscle will activate without you wanting it to, or it won't relax when you want it to. Either way, it would be a muscle cramp. All right, so switching gears a little bit here, we oftentimes call muscle fibers, or which is a muscle fiber is just a muscle cell, it's just another name for it. We oftentimes call muscle fibers by a type. All right, so what I mean by type is we have slow twitch, fast twitch fibers. So in other words, ones that are very, very fast and very, very powerful, or ones that are a little slower, a little less powerful, but more, they can last longer. They're more fatigue resistant. All right, that's the most common split, but there's lots of ways we can split them up into different types. All right, so we're just categorizing muscle cells essentially. All right, so you can look at the biomechanical properties. So you can look at how oxidative it is. In other words, how well does it use oxygen to produce energy for movement? So some of the things that can cause a muscle cell to be more or less oxidative would be the number and density of capillaries. So that's the blood vessels bringing blood to the muscle, to those muscle cells, the amount of mitochondrial density as well. So how much of the organelle that uses that oxygen is there, and also the amount of myoglobin. So myoglobin is kind of like hemoglobin, carries oxygen, but it does so around the cell. So if you have more of any of these, you're going to have a more oxidative muscle fiber. So more likely the slow twitch type 1 muscle fiber types that we'll be talking about in a second. You also have differences in myosin ATPase. All right, so myosin ATPase is the enzyme that breaks down the ATP, all right, that unit of energy, and makes it so we can use it in order to cause a muscle contraction. If you have a very fast, a very speedy myosin ATPase that can break down the ATP, so degrade the ATP, then you can have faster rates of contraction and relaxation. So that means quicker contractions and more of them in a period of time. So that would be more like a fast twitch muscle fiber. All right, so we can also separate muscle fibers into their contractile properties. So do they produce a lot of force? That would be more like a fast twitch or type 2 muscle fiber. Also, you can look at the cross-sectional area, so you can normalize it to cross-sectional area, or just in general, the stronger fibers tend to have bigger cross-sectional areas. You can also look at the speed of contraction, something often called a Vmax. All right, so how quickly does the muscle contract? And again, this is going to be tied to that myosin ATPase that I mentioned up here. And you can look finally at the muscle fiber efficiency. All right, so how well does it handle energy? How long does it take for it to become fatigued? Again, a more fatigue-resistant fiber is a type 1 or a slow twitch type muscle fiber. All right, so these are just different ways you can look to sort of categorize and split up muscle cells. There are other ways as well, but this is just a pretty common list of categories. What we are going to focus on are the slow twitch muscle fibers that are also called type 1s, and the fast twitch muscle fibers, also collectively called type 2, but there's also two different types of those. So we have type 2A and type 2X. Okay, so these in this order, so type 1, type 2A, then type 2X is sort of a continuum of muscle fibers. All right, so there's not clear boundaries between them. There's muscle fibers that fall all the way across this continuum. All right, so but if we categorize them, you can see force production tends to go from small to large here. So low force production for type 1s, high force production for type 2Xs, and the type 2As are in the middle. And typically the type 2As are going to be somewhere in the middle, maybe a little closer to one or the other, the type 1 or the type 2. The velocity of the muscle contraction, again, goes from small to large in this order. So in other words, slower muscle fibers are more likely to be type 1s, faster muscle fibers more likely to be type 2Xs, with the type 2As in between. The diameters, smaller diameters for type 1s, larger diameters for type 2s. The myosin ATPase, the concentration, the type changes as well, but we're just talking about the concentration of the myosin ATPase. It's a lower concentration in type 1s, higher concentration in the type 2s. The fatigue resistance, so in other words, your ability to contract the muscle cell over and over and over again, or to contract it and to hold that contraction for a very long period of time. You're going to be much more fatigue resistant in your type 1 fibers and much more likely to fatigue, so to get tired in your type 2s, especially the type 2Xs, because again, looking at this as a continuum, it's more positive on the type 1 side, more negative, so worse on the type 2X side. Mitochondrial density, same thing, a high density in type 1s, a lower density in type 2Xs, with the type 2As somewhere in the middle. Looking at the dominant source of energy, all right, so the type 1 muscle fiber types are going to be mostly aerobic. Again, when you think of aerobic metabolism, you should be thinking of long, slow, endurance-based activity. So because that's what these type 1s are good at, they're going to use mostly aerobic energy sources. The type 2Xs, the very fast, powerful, the ones that fatigue quickly, those are going to be using more of the anaerobic energy sources. And the type 2As are going to be somewhere in between. The ideal event, so let's say you have a lot of one or the other of these. The ideal event, athletic event, you're talking long, slow, 2 mile, 1 mile at least, so more likely 2 miles, 5K, up to a marathon if you're talking about running. Keeping with the running analogy here, if you got a lot of type 2A fibers, that's where you're going to be sort of the mid distance, the 400, the 800, the 1600 meter, which is the 1 mile race. And then the type 2X fibers are going to be more your explosive movements. So these are your sprinters, your shot putters, your discus throwers, those people, maybe hurdlers as well. All right, so there's a big difference between the muscle fiber types in what they are capable of doing and who would prefer to have more or less of one or the other. And more likely, if you have more of one, that's the type of athlete you're going to become. On that note, non-athletes have about 50% of the slow twitch and about 50% of the fast twitch, so 50% type 1s, 50% type 2 fibers. If you are splitting up the type 2s into type 2As and type 2Bs, or type 2Xs, you're going to have about 25% of your total 100% as type 2As, and same thing for type 2Xs. So 50% slow twitch, 25% type 2As, 25% type 2Xs. All right, that's the normal non-athlete. And we also tend to lose these type 2 fibers as we age just because we don't use them as much. And so they, if you look at an older individual, they're going to be a much higher percentage of type 1 fibers. If you're looking at elite power athletes, so people who have gotten to national and international levels, they're going to have a very high percentage of the fast twitch, the type 2 type fibers. All right, so they're going to be somewhere in the 70 to 75% type 2 fibers typically. If you look on the other end of the spectrum, people who are national and internationally elite endurance athletes, they're going to have a lot more of the slower, more fatigue-resistant type 1 fibers. So they're going to be about 70 to 80% type 1 fibers, and the rest type 2s. All right, so unfortunately though, this ratio isn't something we can really change. It's genetically driven. So whatever you're born with is pretty much what you're stuck with. They're not going to shift too much. They might be, the type 2A fibers might become a little bit more oxidative or a little bit more anaerobic if you train them that way, but they're still going to be type 2A fibers. And the type 2Xs and the type 1s are pretty much stuck where they are. They're not going to train a whole lot in either direction. They're going to do what they're good at. If you're, high school, college age athletes, or you're working with those types of athletes, there's a lot they can do even if they don't have the genetic gift of having the fiber type that they want. So things that are going to affect athletic performance besides just fiber type are going to be cardiovascular function, so your heart's ability to pump blood around the body, their motivation to train, their training habits, so how well you may be training them as their coach or their trainer, and also the muscle size itself. So just because you have a lot of type 2 muscle fibers doesn't mean that they're big muscle fibers. So you can train them and cause hypertrophy, so growth, and so you can have more cross-sectional area muscle, so a stronger muscle. All right, so let's go ahead and stop this first part of the lecture here. So that was a nice overview of the muscles from a sort of global perspective and how they function. The next section is going to be all about sort of microscopic, what's inside the muscle and how the muscle actually contracts in the process of contraction. All right, so please come back and watch that video. Thanks.